Wait till you see me in action.
Greetings, my lord.
Speak,
What is
fool.
it?
Finally. At last. Finally. At last. Finally. At last. This is more like it. Finally. This is more like it. Frostmourne hungers. At last. Frostmourne hungers. At last. This is more like it. Finally. This is more like it. Finally, Frostmourne hungers. What is it now? This is more like it. Finally. This is more like it. Frostmourne hungers. Finally. Frostmourne hungers. Your pain is legendary. Finally. For the Lich King. Your pain is legendary. This is more like it. At last. Frostmourne hungers. At last. Glory to the Scourge. You will end. Your pains are legendary. For the Lich King. Finally. Frostmourne hungers. At last. Finally. This is more like it. At last. Speak, fool. Finally. At last. Frostmourne hungers. This is more like it. Frostmourne hungers. This is more like it. Last, Frostmourne hungers. Frostmourne hungers.
This town needs help.
This is more like it. At last. This is more like it. At last. For the Lich King. Now. Frostmourne hungers. At last. This is more like it.
First blood.
Frostmourne hungers. Finally. Frostmourne hungers. Finally. At last. This is more like it. For the Lich King. Finally. This is more like it. Frostmourne hungers. Finally. This is more like it. At last. Frostmourne hungers. This is more like it. At last. Frostmourne hungers. You will know everything. This is more like it. Finally. At last. This is more like it. At last. Frostmourne hungers. Faithless coward. This is more like it. Finally. Frostmourne hungers. This is more like it. At last. This is more like it. Frostmourne hungers. This is more like it. At last. Finally.
What? Yes, my lord?
No one put us meat around. This is more like it. For the Lich King. At last. Frostmourne hungers. This is more like it. Finally. At last. Frostmourne hungers. At last. This
Our
is more
allies'
like
town needs help.
at last.
Your pain shall be laid. I'll make sure you suffer.
Frostmourne hungers. Finally. This is more like it. Frostmourne hungers. This is more like it. Finally. Frostmourne hungers. At last. Finally. At last. Now.
Our
This is
allies'
more
town
like
needs help.
for the Lich King. Speak, fool. At last. Frostmourne hungers. At last. Frostmourne hungers. Tread lightly. What is it now? At last. This is more like it. Frostmourne hungers. At last. Speak, fool. This is more like it. Frostmourne hungers. Finally. At last.
Our allies' town needs help.
My light for Ner'zhul.
No one orders me around. Speak, fool. Finally. At last. This is more like it. Finally. This is more like it. Finally.
Our allies' town
At
needs
last.
help.
Finally. At last. Now. This is more like it. For the Lich King.
Your pain shall be laid.
Finally. At last. Frostmourne hungers. At last. Frostmourne hungers. Finally. Tread lightly. At last.
Our warriors have engaged the enemy.
This is more like it. Frostmourne hungers. Finally. Frostmourne. Speak, fool. Finally. This is more like it. At last. Finally. This is more like it. At last. Frostmourne hungers. Finally. At last. Frostmourne hungers. At last. Finally. This is more like it.
Our allies' town needs help.
At last.
Faithless coward.
Finally. At last. Frostborn hunger. This is more like it. At last. Tread lightly. Finally. At last. Frostborn hunger. At last. This is more like it. At last. This is more like it. Finally. This is more like it. At last. Finally. At last. Finally. At last. This is more like it. At last. Finally. At last. This is more like it. Finally. This is more like it. Frostborn hungers. This is more like it. At last. Frostborn hungers. Finally. This is more like it. At last. Frostborn hungers. Finally. At last. Finally. Finally. At last.
Yes, my friend.
What is it now? This is more like it. Frostborn hungers. This is more like it. Finally. At last. Frostborn hungers. Finally. Frostborn hungers. Finally. Frostborn hungers. At last. Frostborn hungers. Finally. At last.
Engage the enemy.
Frostborn hungers. This is more like it. At last. Frostborn hungers. At last. Frostborn hungers. At last. Frostborn hungers. Finally. Frostborn hungers. Speak, fool.
Your pain shall be little.
Finally. Frostborn hungers.
You will know anything.
Finally. This is more like it. Finally. No one orders me around. Frostmourne hungers. This is more like it. Frostmourne hungers. Finally. This is more like it. Frostmourne hungers. This is more like it. Finally. This is more like it. At last. This is more like it. Finally. Frostmourne hungers. Finally. At last. Finally. Frostmourne hungers. At last. Finally. At last. Frostmourne hungers. This is more like it. Tread lightly. At last. Finally. At last. Finally. Frostmourne hungers. This is more like it. Frostmourne hungers. This is more like it. At last. Frostmourne hungers. At last. Frostmourne hungers. At last. This is more like it. Frostmourne hungers. This is more like it. Finally.
I'll make sure you suffer.
At last. Finally. Frostmourne hungers.
Killing
Welcome to our
spree.
world.
No one orders me around. Finally. Frostmourne hungers. Finally. This is more like it. Finally. At last. This is at last. Frostmourne hungers. At last.
You will be endless torment.
This is more like it. Finally. Frostmourne hungers. This is more like it. Finally. This is more like it. At last. This is more like it. Frostmourne hungers. Finally. Frostmourne hungers. At last. This is more like it. Finally. Frostmourne hungers. This is more like it. Finally. This is more like it. Frostmourne hungers. This is more like it. Frostmourne hungers. At last. This is more like it.
Glory to the Scourge.
Killing spree. Double kill.
Our warriors
This
have
is more
engaged the enemy.
At last. Frostmourne hungers.
Dominating. Triple kill.
Finally. Frostmourne hungers. This is more like it. At last. This is more like it. Frostmourne hungers. Finally. Frostmourne hungers.
Is my aid required?
What is it now? This is more like it. Frostmourne hungers. At last. This is more like it. No one wants me around. Finally. At last. Finally. Frostmourne hungers. Frostborn hungers.
Mega kill.
Finally. This is more like it. What is it? Frostborn hungers. Finally. This is more like it.
Unstoppable.
This is more like it. Frostborn hungers. Finally. Frostborn hungers. This is more like it. At last. Tread lightly. Finally. At last. This is more like it. At last. This is more like it. This is more like it. Finally. At last. Finally.
Greetings, my lord.
What is it now? Frostborn hunger. This is more like it. Finally. This is more like it. At last. This is more like it. Finally.
Wicked sick.
Frostborn hungers. This is more like it. At last. This is more like it. Finally. This is more like it. At last.
Killing spree. Double kill.
This is more like it. Frostborn hungers. Finally. At last. This is more like it. Frostborn hungers. At last. Speak, fool. Finally.
Who you want me to kill?
Welcome to our village.
Tread lightly. This is more like it. Frostborn hungers. This is more like it. At last. Finally. This is more like it. At last. Frostborn hungers. This is more like it. At last. Frostborn hungers. Finally. At last. Finally. This is more like it. Finally. This is more like it. At last. Finally. Frostborn hungers. Finally. This is more like it. Finally. This is more like it. Frostborn hungers. Finally. This is more like it. Finally. Frostborn hungers. At last. Frostborn hungers. Speak, fool. This is more like it. Frostborn hungers. Finally. Frostborn hungers. Finally. Frostborn hungers. This is what
Dominating.
Frostborn hungers.
Owning.
At last.
Mega double kill. Owning. Dominating.
At last. This is more like Frostborn hunger.
Unstoppable. Triple kill. Owning.
At last, Frostborn hungers. Finally. At last. Finally. At last.
Hello.
No one would have
Killing spree.
At last. Finally. This is what I need. Finally. Frostborn hungers. This is more like it. Finally. Frostborn hungers. What is it? This is more like it. At last. This is more like it. At last. Finally.
Dominating.
Frostborn hungers. At last. This is more like it. Finally. At last. Finally. This is more like it. At last.
Unstoppable.
This is more like it. Finally. At last. Frostborn hungers. This is more like it. At last.
Monster kill.
Frostborn hungers. This is more like it.
Wicked sick.
end this torment.
Ownage.
Frostborn hungers. This is more like it. Frostborn hungers. At last. This is more like it. Finally. At last. Frostborn hungers. Finally. This is more like it. Finally. This is more like it.
Ownage.
Frostborn hungers. Finally. Frostborn hungers.
Double kill. Mega kill. Unstoppable. Double kill. Killing spree.